There's a paradox that almost no one talks about. You've awakened. You see the truth. You feel things that others just don't. And yet, when you look at your bank account, something just doesn't make sense. Why is it that you, someone who understands so much about life, struggles with something as basic as money? Eckhart Tolle spent years observing this pattern, and what he discovered goes against everything you've ever heard about spirituality and abundance. But before I reveal that, I need you to understand something crucial. This isn't about manifestation. It's not about positive thinking. It's about a trap that the spiritual awakening itself has created within you. And it's sabotaging your relationship with money in a way that you don't even realize. See, when most people talk about money and spirituality, they fall into two extremes. They either say that money is evil and that awakened people should reject material wealth, or they say that all you have to do is raise your vibration and the universe will deliver everything you want. Eckhart Tolle disagrees with both of these, and the reason why will probably surprise you. Tolle made an observation that completely changed my understanding of this. He said that there's no problem with having material things. The problem only arises when you become attached to them. But here's the part that no one tells you. Most spiritually awakened people think that they've rejected attachment to money. They think that they've outgrown material need. They think that they're beyond it. And that's exactly why they continue to struggle financially. Let me explain. When you awaken, something happens in your mind. You start to question values that once seemed absolute. Success, status, accumulation. It all starts to seem empty. And naturally, you start to distance yourself from those things. The problem is that along with that healthy distancing, something else seeps in, something that Tolle calls the spiritual ego. The spiritual ego is perhaps the most dangerous form of ego that exists. You know why? Because it disguises itself as spirituality. It makes you believe that you're superior for not caring about money. It makes you feel proud of your material poverty, and most disturbingly, it uses spiritual language to justify your financial struggles. How many times have you said or thought things like, "Money isn't important to me," or "I've chosen a simpler life," or even "Materialistic people are less evolved"? If any of those phrases resonate with you, I need to show you something. Tolle identified that these phrases often don't come from a place of true transcendence. They come from a place of fear, disguised as wisdom. There's a huge difference between not needing money and being afraid to want money. The first is freedom. The second is prison. With the appearance of freedom, and here's the cruel detail, most awakened people are in the second category without even knowing it. But wait, it gets even deeper. Researchers in neuroscience have discovered something fascinating about people who meditate regularly. In a study published with 78 participants, 34 meditators and 44 from the control group were subjected to monetary reward tasks while their brains were scanned. The results were surprising. The meditators showed significantly lower activation in the caudate nucleus during reward anticipation, and reduced activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex during reward receipt. In other words, the brain of someone who meditates literally responds less to monetary rewards. Seems like a good thing, right? Less attachment, less suffering. But Tolle points to a hidden problem here. If you use this as a justification for your financial struggles, you've reversed the cause and effect. Let me be clearer. Healthy detachment comes after internal abundance, not as a substitute for it. When you truly transcend the need for money, you don't avoid money, you simply aren't controlled by it. There's an oceanic difference between those two things. Tolle tells a story that illustrates this perfectly. He talks about a period of his life after his awakening, when he lived on park benches for 2 years. People look at that and think he was enlightened for not needing anything. But Tolle himself clarifies. He wasn't avoiding money. He was in such a deep state of presence that he simply wasn't thinking about the future. It wasn't rejection. It was an absence of temporal thought. And here's the crucial part that changes everything. When Tolle eventually returned to interacting with the material world, he didn't resist. He didn't create stories about how money was bad. He simply allowed things to flow, and that allowing, that absence of resistance, is exactly what's missing in most people who call themselves awakened but struggle financially. Now, I'm going to show you the exact mechanism that creates this struggle, and it will connect everything I've said so far. But first, I need you to understand something about the nature of money itself that Tolle rarely explains in detail. Money, at its essence, is just a form of condensed energy, and like any energy, it responds to your relationship with it. When you fear money, it contracts. When you desire it desperately, it flees, and when you reject it in the name of spirituality, it simply goes away, because you've literally told it to go. Tolle explains in A New Earth that the ego needs things to identify with: possessions, titles, relationships. And when you awaken, the natural reaction is to reject those things. But he also warns that this rejection can be just another form of ego identification. Now you identify as the person who doesn't need anything. Do you see the irony? The question isn't to have or not have. The question is, can you exist fully with or without? That's the true measure of freedom, and most awakened people fail at exactly this point. They can exist without, but they can't exist with. And that's not transcendence. That's just the other side of the same coin of attachment. When you awaken spiritually, you often go through a period of intense psychological turbulence. Research shows that spiritual awakening often occurs after periods of great psychological distress, what's called hitting rock bottom in the literature. And during this phase of reconstruction, something happens to your relationship with money. You start to associate your previous materialistic life with suffering, and naturally, you start to reject anything that reminds you of that life, including the pursuit of financial security. This seems healthy on the surface. It seems like evolution, but Tolle identifies this as a subtle form of aversion. Not transcendence. True transcendence, according to Tolle, doesn't involve rejection of anything. It involves complete acceptance of what is, including money, including material abundance, including the very desire for security. The financial struggles of many awakened individuals stem precisely from this disguised aversion. And now comes the most uncomfortable part. Many people on the spiritual journey have developed what we might call a spiritual scarcity programming. They were taught early on that money is evil, that rich people are bad, that to be accepted in the world, you mustn't be financially abundant. Good people struggle with money. That's the script many have internalized. And when they awaken, this script doesn't disappear. It just gets a new wrapper. Now, scarcity isn't because you don't deserve it. It's because you're too evolved to care. See how clever the ego is? It's taken your childhood wound and turned it into a spiritual virtue. Eckhart Tolle is very clear about this. He says there's no problem in desiring money. What hinders spiritual growth is excessive attachment. When spiritual teachers encourage you to abandon money and material possessions, they're teaching you to release attachment, not to reject money itself. But most people misinterpret it. Most think they need to live in scarcity to be spiritual. And this misinterpretation creates the very opposite of what spirituality promises. It creates more suffering, not less. Remember what I said at the beginning about the paradox? Here's the resolution to it. You don't struggle financially. Despite being awakened, you struggle financially because you haven't yet completed the awakening in relation to money. There's an aspect of your being that's still sleeping when it comes to material abundance. And until that aspect awakens, you'll remain stuck in this limbo. Tolle said something in a 2010 interview that few people quote. He said that an enlightened person or business doesn't primarily worry about making money. Because when you're worried about making money, you want the future more than the present. And here's the key. Not wanting the future doesn't mean rejecting money. It means being so present that money can flow without resistance. The difference is subtle, but transformative. Wanting money desperately creates resistance. Spiritually rejecting money also creates resistance. The only position that doesn't create resistance is the present acceptance of everything that is, including your current financial situation, including your desire for improvement, including money itself. And that brings us to the central revelation that Tolle makes on this topic. The ego doesn't care if you're attached to having money or attached to not having money. For the ego, any attachment serves its purpose. Any rigid position fuels the separate identity. So when you create an identity as a spiritual person who doesn't care about money, you're still operating from the ego. Only the content has changed, not the structure. True freedom, according to Tolle, is in having no position on money, neither for nor against, just presence with what is. And from that presence, paradoxically, abundance tends to flow more easily. Because there are no more internal blocks, neither of greed nor of aversion. But let me go deeper here, because this is crucial and rarely explained. Tolle speaks extensively about what he calls the pain body. It's an energetic structure of accumulated suffering that lives within you and feeds on more suffering. And guess what? There's a specific pain body related to money. It was formed by all the painful experiences you've had with money throughout your life. The times you saw your parents fighting over bills, the times you felt shame for not being able to buy something, the times you were judged for having or not having. This financial pain body is active in almost everyone, but in spiritually awakened people, it takes on a particularly insidious form. It disguises itself as detachment. It hides behind noble phrases about not caring about material things. And so, it's never confronted. It's never healed. It just changes shape. Tolle would say that the only way to dissolve this pain body is to bring it into the light of consciousness, to feel completely the discomfort that arises when you think about abundance, to observe without judgment the automatic reactions that your body has when the topic is money. And in that conscious observing, something begins to release. But most people prefer to avoid it. They prefer to use spiritual language so they don't have to look. And the pain body remains intact, silently sabotaging every attempt to create abundance. Now, let me show you how this manifests in practice. Because theory without application doesn't transform anything. Observe your body now when I think about money, not your ideas about money and your body. Is there tension? Is there contraction? Is there any place that closes off? That physical sensation is the sign that there's still unresolved attachment. And it doesn't matter if the attachment is for wanting more or for rejecting what you have. Tolle teaches that presence dissolves attachments. So the first step isn't to change your financial situation. It's to bring total presence to your relationship with money, to feel completely what arises when you think about bills, about costs, about abundance, about scarcity, without judging, without creating stories, just feeling. And in that conscious feeling, something begins to change. The pain body related to money, which maybe you've carried since childhood, begins to dissolve. Not because you solved the financial problem, but because you stopped feeding the suffering with your resistance. Research on mindfulness and money confirms this. Studies show that mindfulness training can significantly reduce stingy attitudes towards money and increase ethical beliefs about consumption. In other words, presence doesn't make you indifferent to money. It makes you healthy in relation to it. And here's the most powerful insight that Tolle offers. Money is energy. It needs to flow continuously, just like blood in the body. When we cling to money out of fear or scarcity, we block the natural flow of abundance. But equally, when we reject money out of spiritual belief, we also block that flow. The only position that allows the flow is openness. And openness requires presence, requires being here, now, without stories about what money means or doesn't mean. Have you noticed something in this moment? If you've made it this far, feeling discomfort, that's good. That discomfort is the ego being exposed. And when the ego is exposed, it can be transcended. The Eckhart Tolle Foundation, created in 2016, has an interesting mission. She focuses on alleviating suffering and promoting spiritual awakening, making teachings more accessible to young people, students, those incarcerated, hospice patients, and other vulnerable beings. Notice something curious here. Tolle, who is worth tens of millions of dollars according to various sources, sees no contradiction between wealth and spiritual service. That should tell you something important. The person who most profoundly teaches about presence and detachment in the modern world doesn't live in scarcity. He lives in abundance while serving, and that is the true resolution of the paradox I presented at the beginning. You can be awakened and abundant. You can be present and prosperous. You can transcend the ego and still have resources. In fact, when you truly transcend, resources often increase because all the energy that was previously going into resistance, fear, and aversion is now available for creation and service. There's a concept in The Power of Now that applies directly here. Tolle talks about the difference between creating from presence versus creating from ego. When you act from presence, your actions have a different quality. They flow. They don't force. They don't manipulate. And paradoxically, they tend to produce better results. Applied to finances, this means that financial actions taken from a place of presence, without fear, without greed, simply as a natural expression of the moment, tend to be more effective. Not because there's some mystical law of attraction, but because when you're not fighting internally, all your energy is available to act intelligently. Think about that for a moment. How much energy do you spend resisting money? How much energy goes into anxious thoughts about bills, into comparisons with others, into justifications about why you don't have what others have? All that energy, when released, can be redirected toward creation, and genuine, present, authentically motivated creation tends to generate abundance naturally. But here's the crucial point that differentiates this perspective from all the manifestation gurus. Tolle isn't telling you to visualize wealth. He isn't telling you to affirm abundance. He's saying something much more radical. He's saying to stop having any position on the subject, neither for nor against. Just be completely present with what is in this moment, without stories. But that requires something courageous. It requires looking honestly at where you're still using spirituality as an excuse not to deal with your relationship with money. It requires admitting that maybe, just maybe, your financial struggle isn't a sign of evolution. Maybe it's a sign of an area where awakening hasn't yet arrived. And when you can admit that without shame, without judgment, just with compassionate presence, something opens. The path to a healthy relationship with money begins not when you learn manifestation techniques, but when you stop resisting what money really is: energy, flow, possibility. Tolle frequently talks about accepting what is. And accepting what is includes accepting that you live in a world where money exists, where bills need to be paid, where financial security affects well-being. Denying that isn't spirituality. It's avoidance dressed up as wisdom, and that brutal honesty with yourself is the first real step to transforming your situation. Not visualizations, not affirmations, pure honesty about where you are, how you got here, and what hidden beliefs are keeping you stuck. You've just discovered why so many spiritually awakened people remain financially stuck. This understanding isn't common. Most spiritual channels will never tell you this because it challenges the comfortable narrative that poverty is virtue. When you click the heart down below, you're not just supporting this channel, you're declaring yourself as someone willing to see the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, someone who's chosen to awaken completely, including in the financial area. Now, let me give you something practical to take away. In the next 7 days, every time you have a thought about money, stop. Don't continue the thought. Don't create the story. Just feel what happens in the body. Where does the tension appear? Where does the contraction arise? And then, consciously, breathe into that place. Not to change anything, or just to be present with what is. This simple exercise, done consistently, will start to reveal your unconscious patterns with money. Patterns that may have been active for decades. And in the light of consciousness, those patterns lose power, not because you fought against them, but because you stopped running from them. Tolle says that conscious suffering transcends, so bring awareness to your financial suffering, not to torture yourself, but to finally see what's really happening, and from that clear vision, different actions arise naturally. Not forced, not strategic, natural. There's a second exercise that complements the first. Observe your actions related to money during the next week. Don't judge, just observe. Notice when you avoid thinking about finances. Notice when you use spiritual phrases to justify questionable financial choices. Notice when you feel superiority for not caring about material things. This observing reveals patterns that were operating in the dark, and in the light of observation, they lose strength. You start to realize that much of what seemed like spiritual detachment was actually avoidance in disguise. And realizing that isn't failure, it's the beginning of true transcendence. Tolle mentions that the observer is the presence. When you can observe your patterns with money without being dragged down by them, you demonstrate that you're not those patterns. You're the consciousness that observes them. And that consciousness has no problem with money, has no problem with abundance, has no problem with anything. It simply is. The signs that this is working are subtle at first. You'll notice less anxiety when you think about money. You'll notice more clarity about what you really need versus what the ego wants. You'll notice financial decisions arising from a place of peace instead of fear. And eventually, you'll notice that the flow of abundance starts to change, not because you manifested it, but because you stopped blocking it. 40 years of data from 63 countries and 420,000 individuals have shown that money can't buy happiness. That's true. But the common spiritual interpretation of that research is wrong. The conclusion isn't that you should avoid money. The conclusion is that you should stop seeking happiness in money. And those are two completely different paths. One leads you to spiritual scarcity. The other leads you to present abundance. One keeps you struggling. The other frees you to flow. Remember what I said at the beginning about Tolle and his foundation. He doesn't reject money. He uses it to serve. His retreats cost significant amounts. His online courses have prices, and yet no one questions his spiritual authenticity. Why is that? because he's clearly not attached to the money. He simply allows it to exist while focusing on what really matters. Presence. Service. Awakening. That's the model. Not rejection, not greed. Allowing. And from allowing, abundance flows to where it can serve best. That's the healthy relationship with finances that Tolle exemplifies. And it's the exact opposite of what many people in the spiritual community believe to be virtuous. You can get there too. But first, you need to stop using spirituality as a shield. You need to look honestly at your beliefs about money. You need to fully feel the discomfort that it causes. And then, in the light of that awareness, let the transformation happen naturally. The question isn't whether you should have money or not. The question is, can you be completely present with money, whether it's a lot or a little? If the answer is no, there's still work to do. And that work isn't about money. It's about presence. And before I wrap things up, I want to make one thing clear. Nothing I've said here is about blaming you. It's not about saying you're wrong for struggling financially. It's about illuminating a blind spot that maybe you haven't noticed. About showing that spiritual awakening is a continuous process, not a one-time event. And about offering the possibility that your relationship with money can be as enlightened as any other area of your life. Tolle would say that there's nothing to fix. There's only awareness to bring. And when you bring total awareness to any area of your life, including your finances, the transformation happens by itself. Not forced, not planned, natural. Think of it like shining a flashlight into a dark room. The darkness doesn't need to be fought. It simply dissipates in the presence of light. So start today, not with drastic actions, just with observation, awareness, presence. The rest comes after. Final controversial thought. Most spiritually awakened people are using spirituality to avoid addressing their relationship with money. Agree or disagree? Write it in the comments and be honest. How many times have you used a spiritual phrase to justify your financial situation? I'll be reading every comment for the next 2 hours and responding to the most courageous ones. Let's get real about this.